Mr. Wallace, who's presently serving 10 years for manslaughter in an English jail, was known to have links with British intelligence.
Wallace claimed he was an intelligence officer. Wallace alleges he became involved in a black propaganda campaign by the security services.
There was no evidence to support the claims of Mr. Colin Wallace.
Until anybody can produce proper evidence, there is no need to have an inquiry.
Colin Wallace had fractured Mr. Lewis's skull with a karate-style blow after he was accused of having an affair with Mr. Lewis's wife. He hid his friend's body in the boot of his car and later dumped it in the River Arun. He said
of August 1973, an article in the Belfast Sunday News reported that sheep had been sacrificed in a black magic ritual on Copeland Island Beach, northeast of Belfast.
It was a front-page headline in the Sunday News which lots of people read. The story was that sheep had been ritually killed and mutilated. That was the story, and that it was Satanists who had done this. As a would-be anthropologist and undergraduate at the time, it tweaked my interests, and I began to pay attention as other news stories appeared in other local papers. The more I looked, the more I found, and I began to be really surprised at the degree to which this had been a local newspaper story in Northern Ireland.
From August 1973, stories of witchcraft and black magic began to surface in many local newspapers.
The first thing that I had to do was try and understand what witchcraft would look like, and we had no idea. So I bought a book on the subject. Then the whole idea of the sacrifice of animals or whatever it might have been, we got blood from the cookhouse, from the army cookhouse, and we would scatter that over the makeshift altars that were there. Some of that material then we left, and it would be discovered by local people, and then eventually they would talk about it at the press. And gradually the story built up and built up over a period of months. This was a way of really getting the interest of the press, getting rumours going around, and therefore doing the things that we really wanted to happen.
The ritual sites were often located in old graveyards and abandoned properties.
You have to remember that this was a time in Northern Ireland when all kinds of unusual things were happening. Assassinations were a very regular thing, and some of them were particularly bloody and brutal. Torture, mutilation, using knives and blades and things like that. People were talking about ritual murders and all kinds of things. So all of a sudden, all of the moral certainties no longer seem to be quite just as certain.
Information policy sent fake readers' letters to the local press to help fan the rumours.
Quite often, on different subjects, we would write to local newspapers drawing attention to something or criticising something, and then the newspaper would publish that. And it would usually be about a local issue, and it was very much done at local level. But then we would pick up the publication of those letters, and we would then circulate those letters more to the national press to reflect what would be portrayed as local views. Don't forget that we're not just influencing the press. The press is only one way of influencing the public. We had to be able to influence all sorts of other people who were, communicating with the public. And the churches then, in the 70s, had much more influence, of course, than they have today. And therefore, this involvement of witchcraft was quite important. The key thing we wanted the clergy to do, I think, was just to try and go back to reject all types of violence and questionable behaviour, and whether that was drugs or witchcraft or terrorism, it was to say that these activities really have no place in the society that we were trying to create. And because at that stage people's world was dominated by the fear of terrorism, we were directly linking a lot of these things together. It was important to look at evil, bad, and terrorism all within one package.
They were particularly interested in getting at the Protestant population and getting them to believe in this stuff. They were trying to scare the bejesus out of the local population and to attach that fright to the terrible things that were going on, ergo the paramilitaries. That's, I think, what the core job of what they were doing was. They were trying to discredit the paramilitaries. They were trying to associate them with bad things, drug dealing, dodgy financial dealings, etc., etc.
We were just saying, look, the fact that the community has now sort of dissolved into this violence, which is becoming more and more sadistic in terms of sectarian assassinations, you know, where do you draw a halt as a community? I think it helped to bring home to people that there was something going on in their community that really was not good for them as a whole.
That is a strange way of thinking, because, you know, you are part of the army and the idea is that you are fighting a war. But you are saying the witchcraft campaign was about bringing a sense of morality back to the community. You wouldn't really have thought that the army would think about that.
Probably not, but I think, you see, it is a war, but it's not a conventional war. Terrorism is fundamentally a propaganda war that is backed up by armed conflict. So it was just, I think, going back to say to people, you know, you have grown up, as I did in Northern Ireland, with a very strong belief in the community and in our own church, whatever that religion was. And surely we have drifted a long way from that as a result of the violence of the last 5-6 years.
On the 8th of September 1973, the burnt and mutilated body of 10-year-old Brian McDermott was discovered by the River Lagan in Belfast.
People began to speculate, was this a black magic killing? And it certainly contributed towards one of the threads in the rumours and fears that autumn, which was that Satanists were looking for children to abduct.
Newspapers reported rumours that a boy or girl under 7 would be sacrificed.
The police actually issued statements saying they believed that the murder may have involved witchcraft. That was a concern for us at that stage, because bearing in mind that we were creating this concept, at that point we stopped using witchcraft as a concept.
But that was in September, and according to Richard Jenkins, the witchcraft scare continued all the way to the beginning of 1974.
I think that's right, and one of the points we were making is that when you create a story, it gathers momentum over a period of time. And I think although we stopped doing things, there were lots of other stories and rumours going around. And there may also have been people, you know, creating these things for fun, really, to do that. But we certainly stopped after Brian McDermott's death. There's no doubt about that, I'm absolutely clear. But it may well be that the aftermath of that was still going on for a period of some time, even to the beginning of the following year.
From early September to December 1973, there were more than 70 articles referring to black magic and witchcraft. By the beginning of the following year, the topic had almost completely vanished from the press. When the British Prime Minister of the IRD began a new life in West Sussex. In January 1980, the Irish Independent published an article on the abuse of boys at the Belfast boys' home Kincora. The housefathers William McGrath, Joseph Mains and Raymond Semple had been sexually abusing the boys in their care. Politicians in Northern Ireland demanded a full inquiry.
The body, which was found last Friday in the river, had head injuries. And this is a matter for the pathologist who is making this examination to find out whether in fact the person died as a result of drowning or as a result of the head injuries.
Colin Wallace had fractured Mr. Lewis's skull with a karate-style blow during a meeting at his house after he was accused of having an affair with Mr. Lewis's wife. He hid his friend's body in the boot of his car and later dumped it in the River Arun.
Colin Wallace was charged with the murder. The prosecution alleged he was infatuated with Jane Lewis, the deceased's wife. He was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years on the 20th of March 1981.
"65-year-old housefather William McGrath, seen here in the foreground. He ran 2 Bible study centres in Belfast in the 50s and 60s. McGrath was also a founding member of the Protestant paramilitary group Tara.
This man was one of McGrath's victims.
And he would come up like naked and dressed, and then he'd start doing things he done, like, you know, he says. And so one time I was bleeding, I told him to stop. It wasn't pleasant, like this. He couldn't turn to no one, you know.
One of the Army's former press officers at Thiepval Barracks in Lisburn, Colin Wallace, is now a key figure in the Kincora investigation. Mr. Wallace, who's presently serving 10 years for manslaughter in an English jail, was also known to have links with British intelligence. Kevin Dowling, exactly what did Colin Wallace tell you in 1973?
He certainly said that McGrath was a homosexual. You must remember that the conversation I had with him was in 1973. I don't remember the conversation entirely clearly. It has been suggested to me that McGrath was in fact some kind of an army informer, and that the police felt obliged to protect him in order to bring to book greater criminals than he.
Exactly what part did British intelligence play, and were they aware that William McGrath was employed at Kincora?
British Army files relating to the Kincora Boys' Home disappeared from Army headquarters. It was rumoured that William McGrath was an MI5 informant. McGrath, Mains and Semple, who ran the Kincora Boys' Home, were sentenced in December 1981. All were released in under 2 years. Meanwhile, Colin Wallace was still only at the beginning of his 10-year sentence.
When I first got to know him, he was in prison. And it was bizarre. He was actually protected in prison. There were other prisoners believed him. And he actually had kind of bodyguards, because they thought, probably correctly, that he might be killed, assassinated in prison.
Clive Ponting was head of the legal department at the Ministry of Defence in 1983 and remembers a meeting with MI5 where Colin Wallace was discussed.
There was never any suspicion that Wallace was making these stories up and it was all totally unfounded and very easy to rubbish. It was very much a matter that, that the story was being contained at the moment because he was in jail, but that in a few years' time he'd be back out again and could be expected to start making the allegations again.
One evening in prison, Colin Wallace read an article about Fred Holroyd, a former military intelligence officer in Northern Ireland, whose experience bore some resemblance to his own. Colin wrote a letter to Fred asking for help.
When I got to the prison, I realised this was the same man that I'd met in the secret corridor who had an office in Army headquarters. The MOD repeatedly were refuting that he was anything more than a civilian clerk with a Walter Mitty complex, and yet here he is with an office in this secret corridor with the political officer, MI5, MI6. All of the people who were running the army were in that office. I went on the same day the murder was committed. At the same time, you've got every man and his dog walking along that path. You've got fishermen overlooking it about 100 yards away on a bridge. You have all sorts of courting couples walking along and boats going up and down the river. The thing was, Trafalgar Square on a Saturday. The story that the police had put out was a lie. I also discovered a witness who had seen the dead man after he'd allegedly been killed by Colin. The police persuaded her not to give evidence.
was sitting by the window with the gentleman he was with, a man in approximately his 50s with thinning grey hair combed back over the top of his head. And as far as I remember, I think he was in a grey suit. Whatever exchange came from Jonathan Lewis, it was sharp and then back to looking at it and fiddling with his glass on his knee. He looked far from happy.
She was frightened of the police. She thought the police were in on it.
Fred Holroyd doorsteps the boatman who had found the body.
And he didn't know who I was. They all get very frightened when I arrive and start asking him questions about things that they're worried about themselves. And he said, I can tell you that the buggers wouldn't let me give the evidence I wanted to give, which was, that I'd reversed back and my propeller had hit the guy in the face. And that's what caused the wound. And I said, you're kidding? He said, no. So I said, are you prepared to put that down in writing? He said, well, if I have to, but the best thing would be to get me in a court and ask me questions, and then I have to answer in a courtroom, and the police can't do me any harm.
When Colin was still in prison, he was, via his solicitor, he was sending out various documents that he'd written. I was unemployed, and in those days in Hull, in Mrs. Thatcher's Britain, in a place like Hull with unemployment at 10%, if you had something to do, and I did, the people on the dole would ignore you for years. So I carried on doing this journalism stuff.
Lobster, an obscure magazine made on a photocopier with a circulation of 150, co-founded and co-edited by Ramsey and Dorrell, may at the time have been the only publication in Britain to take Colin Wallace's allegations seriously.
I wrote this, which was 50 pages, an attempt to explain Colin's story. We printed quite a lot of these, about 1,000 copies, I think. And we went to London and had a press conference. So two hicks from the States turn up carrying this big document and say, here's a big story. The media were not impressed at all. Virtually no response to it.
In January 1987, Colin Wallace was released from prison.
A journalist called Julian O'Halloran went to Lewis Prison, actually filmed Colin Wallace as he stepped out of the prison gate and interviewed him. And it was going to be broadcast on Newsnight. I was actually watching Newsnight when there was a great kerfuffle in the studio. Something had happened and bits of paper were being looked at and headphones were being checked. And what had happened was the Wallace segment had been yanked at the last minute by a man called Alan Prothero, who at that point was deputy director of the BBC. Prothero was a part-time army officer in the Territorial Army, and his speciality was media-military relations. I went down to visit him and Fred, and it was the middle of winter. We were sitting in Colin Wallace's unheated house. He'd come out of prison and he couldn't afford to heat it. And so we were all sitting in our coats in Colin's living room, and I remember saying something like, so your plan is that me and you two guys with no money between us are going to take on MI5 and the MOD. Yes, that's the plan, they said.
Irish broadcaster RTE picked up the story.
The record says that Colin Wallace killed Jonathan Lewis.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Did you?
No, I didn't. I had nothing at all to do with his death. I wasn't involved in any way. But I mean, if I'm not calm about it, if I panic about it, I create a fuss, I get excited about it, that's not going to change the verdict any quicker than if I stay calm and deal with it properly through the correct channels.
Eventually I was hired by Channel 4 News. Colin had these handwritten notes that he claimed he'd written down from about this MI5 disinformation project against mostly against Labour MPs. Robert Parker of Channel 4 News went to a forensic scientist called Dr. Julius Grant.
What chances do you think there are that these notes are forgeries?
Well, from what I've already said, the chances that they're forgeries seem to be rather remote.
And thus these documents were in fact written probably when Wallace said they were written. While we were working together on bits and pieces about Wallace, another journalist in ITN, who was one of their crime correspondents, began feeding information he was getting from the MOD, the Ministry of Defence, denigrating Wallace. We were also getting similar stuff from Professor Paul Wilkinson, a terrorism expert, again denigrating Wallace and saying he's a fantasist and a liar.
Investigative journalist Paul Foote wrote a book about Colin Wallace. Wallace began to appear in the British media more frequently, including on popular ITV weekly debate show Central Weekend Live.
If you take the case of Mr. Wallace here, as everybody else who's ever convicted of any crime, poor Mr. Wallace was framed. I don't believe he was framed.
The point that he made.
Any responsible journalist in Northern Ireland in the early 70s knew what Colin Wallace was up to. There was this gung-ho character who was running around at dead of night, shoving envelopes full of documents into the letter boxes of journalists. And you'd say, there's Collins at it again.
I, for one, I was probably the first person in the CIA who got into this dirty tricks business. They weren't as dirty as a lot of people
Yeah, because a lot of people find it very objectionable.
But it wasn't just a minute. It's to blacken someone's a hell of a lot better than killing him. In World War II, we killed people. And then now, when we got into business, well, we were simply playing dirty tricks to prevent having World War III.
You're the man that sparked all this off.
I did not join the security forces to discredit the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party. And because I was deflected from my main job into doing political disinformation, I was not actually doing the job I joined to do.
Good evening. A civil servant sacked after making allegations about an MI5 dirty tricks campaign has been awarded £30,000 compensation by the government.
Calcutta QC was asked to conduct an inquiry. In his report, he reveals that Ministry of Defence officials contacted Mr. Wallace's disciplinary hearing beforehand, thus influencing the outcome. The Defence Secretary, Tom King, asked Mr. Calcutta not to write a full report.
Labour's Northern Ireland Secretary between 1974 and 76 said he had been the victim of a dirty tricks campaign.
Who instructed Mr. Wallace to do the job that he and others did? That's what we've got to know. We want to be sure that this sort of thing never happens again. I feel very strongly about it.
Mrs. Thatcher, having insisted there was no evidence to back such claims, was forced to admit in the Commons that she'd been misled. This followed the discovery of documents in the Ministry of Defence which related to a propaganda campaign codenamed Clockwork Orange.
He's calling for the government to launch a full inquiry.
And justice to me is really a minor matter. The much more important matters are the allegations that there was an attempt to influence the general elections in 1974 and indeed the assaults on the children in Kincora during the 70s. My aspect of the story really is only a minor one by comparison.
The government specifically ruled out the reopening of the investigation into the alleged cover-up of the homosexual abuse of boys at the Kincora home in Belfast.
Information about homosexual behaviour at the Kincora boys' home was used to blackmail prominent figures in Northern Ireland.
After I left Northern Ireland, another intelligence officer who came in called Brian Gemmell, he was told about the allegations surrounding the abuses at Kincora. He wrote a report about them. He submitted that report to a senior MI5 officer, Ian Cameron, who then told him to stop investigating.
You know, on the phone we got phone calls of generals said, yes, I knew all about Kincora, I was told, and I took it to MI5 and they said it was none of my business and I left it to them, it was their business. And all this sort of stuff, and you know, the realisation, like me, the light is dawning, that we are not who we say we are.
Journalist David Lay tracks down Dennis Payne, the former head of MI5 in Northern Ireland, to a sleepy village in the countryside and confronted him with the Clockwork Orange allegations.
I'm under an obligation to say absolutely nothing. I can't say anything at all. I mean, you collect all the information. I can't believe anyone is in the slightest bit interested in it, but I have nothing to add.
In 1996, Colin Wallace appealed his conviction for manslaughter.
Today, 15 years after he was jailed for manslaughter, Colin Wallace from West Sussex cleared his name.
He served 6 years in the 1980s after being found guilty of killing an antiques dealer near his home in West Sussex.
During the appeal hearing, the Home Office pathologist admitted that a Secret Service agent had suggested to him that the injury was caused by a karate chop to the head and not from the propeller of a boat.
The hearing of the Court of Appeal focused largely on new medical evidence about the injury Jonathan Lewis received.
Jonathan Lewis was most probably attacked at the riverbank and not at his house. And he said there was no evidence that his body had ever been in Colin Wallace's car.
He says he was the victim of an MI5 dirty tricks campaign. Now Mr. Wallace is demanding a full investigation into his claims.
Even after Colin Wallace received compensation, his troubles with MI5 were not over.
When I was working at BIA, MI5 contacted the head of security there, and then I was made redundant after that. Now, I can't say MI5 was responsible, but again, why were they still meddling in my case after all of those years?
The media report...
18-year-old Catholic schoolgirl.
In the story of Colin Wallace,
some of the areas of the troubles that are still closed.
I can't say precisely because that would put me in jeopardy. And it would put Colin in deep jeopardy. But there are certain areas of the troubles which haven't simply not been talked about at all. You know, there are things about there's a suicide in Northern Ireland of a military intelligence officer. One of the key events, it's an official secret. A suicide is an official secret. And so far, no one has written about it. And some of the events around that are appalling, in that he ran agents who were 14 and 15-year-old Catholic schoolgirls. This is how desperate the army at some stage became to get intelligence. And you kind of say, how do you run a 14?